Hey friends, it's Jimmy quickly dropping in with a reminder to like and subscribe and to hit that notification bell. Also, don't forget to leave a quick comment saying where you're watching from or what you're up to right now. General George S. Patton Jr. was the most aggressive and arguably the most successful field commander the Allies possessed. He led troops and armies across the Mediterranean and European theaters, delivering decisive victories. His career was a tapestry of glorious, life-threatening moments. Yet his final chapter arrived unexpectedly, 12 days after a seemingly routine collision on a German road. Patton was a modern figure torn out of history books, who appeared to have been a man out of place and time. A figure who towered above even his highly respected peers. This stark contrast between his heroic life and quiet death remains the single most powerful factor fueling the decades of persistent skepticism about the true circumstances of his demise. Patton was born in 1885 and was a figure of intense contradiction, possessing both brilliant strategic acumen and a famously hot-tempered nature. His men, recognizing his demanding but ultimately effective leadership, colorfully referred to him as Old Blood and Guts, a nickname straight out of the 19th century. Patton demanded strict discipline and self-sacrifice, and in return, he delivered exceptional results, fostering immense pride within his ranks. In his early years, he was far from a model student, struggling with reading and spelling early on, leading some to speculate he lived with undiagnosed dyslexia. Yet, he matured into a voracious reader who later published numerous articles on military tactics for the War Department. Patton's personal life mirrored his military intensity. He was notoriously accident-prone, pursuing activities like polo with a reckless abandon. These accidents resulted in multiple serious injuries, including broken legs, a fractured nose, and frequent head injuries. Some historians have even claimed that these head injuries may have contributed to the erratic behavior that plagued his later career. His military philosophy hinged on relentless execution, speed, and adaptability. Arguably the Allies' most gifted tank commander, the pinnacle of his career was the dramatic, swift sweep of his Third Army across northern France in the summer of 1944. This campaign demonstrated initiative, ruthless drive, and a deliberate disregard for conservative military doctrine, capturing key cities like Le Mans and Reims. Patton's dedication to speed proved vital during the catastrophic German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. He repositioned the Third Army with astonishing speed to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, Belgium. By the time the Third Army ceased operations upon VE Day in May 1945, his forces had captured over 80,000 square miles of territory. Crucially, while incurring roughly 137,000 casualties, the Third Army inflicted 1.8 million casualties on the enemy, mostly in the form of men who surrendered. This incredible success established Patton as an irreplaceable military genius, at least while World War II was ongoing. His personality ensured he would remain a controversial figure destined for friction with the political establishment in peacetime. Following the collapse of the German regime, Patton's aggressive nature, which had been so essential to battlefield success, suddenly became a dangerous political liability. Patton found himself wholly unsuited for the administrative post-war role of commanding the U.S. 15th Army. The story of how he came to find himself in this role is defined by his political actions rather than any other issue. His outspokenness, always a feature of his command style, quickly transitioned from inspiring to inflammatory when confronted with the complex realities of nascent Cold War tensions. In September 1945, Patton ignited a firestorm by publicly questioning the necessity of the Allied policy of removing Germans who had been officials in the Reich from power. He publicly questioned why the American authorities had such a strong desire to wipe out the ideology that drove the Reich. This failure in diplomacy was too brazen for the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, who promptly removed Patton as the U.S. commander in Bavaria. From there, he was sidelined with the 15th Army, a role he would keep until his untimely death. More dangerously, Patton held a deep distrust of the Soviet Union in particular, and of communist ideology more generally. Much of the American leadership, including the late President Roosevelt, maintained a somewhat naive view of Stalin, hoping for post-war cooperation. Patton held no such illusions and viewed the Soviets as the next great global enemy. In private, he advocated for immediate, preemptive military action to push the Red Army back beyond the borders they had seized in Eastern Europe. Patton astutely observed that the Soviet supply lines were highly vulnerable, running on little more than ox carts. He also noted that the Soviets lost tens of millions of people on the Eastern Front and were exhausted from war. He noted that America didn't suffer these sort of consequences and could use both Europe and Europeans in the attack. Under this theory, this meant the Allies could have likely broken the Red Army's back permanently within months if they attacked immediately following VE Day. This demand for war with an ostensible ally represented a fundamental threat to the delicate geopolitical order being constructed by world leaders. Patton's fiery rhetoric meant he was a loose cannon capable of derailing fragile diplomatic efforts and starting a global war. In the eyes of both American officials seeking stability and Soviet officials determined to retain their gains, Patton had become an existential threat who needed silencing. This context of profound political antagonism is essential to understanding why the circumstances of his death continue to generate so much suspicion. The official account states that Patton suffered his fatal injuries on the morning of December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany. Patton, accompanied by his chief of staff, was heading out for a pleasant pheasant hunt. The general was riding in the back seat of his 1938 Cadillac staff car. At the wheel was his new chauffeur, Private Horace Woodring, who had a reputation as a speed demon. This was a trait that, ironically considering the outcome, appealed to the general. As the car sped over a railroad crossing, Woodring collided with a left-turning U.S. Army truck attempting to enter a nearby depot. While Patton's longtime previous driver had safely navigated thousands of miles under every condition imaginable, Woodring failed to avoid this simple, low-speed accident. Remarkably, Patton was the only person in either vehicle to suffer severe injury. He was rushed to the 135th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where X-rays revealed his neck was broken. Specifically, there was a fractured C3 vertebra and a dislocation at C4 and C5, resulting in complete quadriplegia. For 12 days, Patton lay in traction. The medical reality of his injury in 1945 cannot be overstated. Traumatic spinal cord injuries, even today, present a high risk of fatal complications. For a patient immobilized with quadriplegia in the mid-1940s, the end was imminent. The official report confirms that Patton died quietly in his sleep on the evening of December 21, 1945, due to a pulmonary embolism. A blood clot, forming in his paralyzed lower body, had traveled to his heart or lungs, stopping the circulation. Patton's death quickly generated an atmosphere of deep distrust, transforming the official accident narrative into one of the most hotly contested events of the immediate post-war period. Those closest to Patton, including his brother-in-law Fred Ayer Jr., an officer with counterintelligence in Germany, immediately suspected foul play. This skepticism wasn't merely emotional. It stemmed from the convergence of Patton's extreme political isolation and certain irregularities surrounding the official investigation. The lack of comprehensive, publicly accessible documentation became a key pillar of the conspiracy theories. It's claimed that Patton himself, in an act of compassion, ordered the investigation halted, indicating he believed that this was an accident. This decision, coupled with the alleged destruction or disappearance of military files, created a substantial informational vacuum that has since been interpreted as a cover-up. The primary theories focus on two distinct sets of actors who possessed powerful motives. First, the Soviet NKVD is often cited, driven by Patton's open declaration of intent to initiate a war against the Red Army. Second, theories point toward internal American elements, specifically alleging the involvement of the Office of Strategic Services. This was the intelligence agency that would splinter into the CIA and other intelligence agencies after the war. Some have speculated that Patton was neutralized as a dangerous political factor, though no proof of this exists. The methods proposed for his assassination vary, often aligning perfectly with the official facts to avoid contradiction. Some more outlandish theories suggest that Patton was actually shot during the low-speed collision, explaining why no one else was injured. Unsurprisingly, though, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest this was the case, and this would suggest a much wider conspiracy. The most common theories suggest that his death by pulmonary embolism was simply not prevented, and that in essence he died of neglect. This would, in essence, involve the members of his medical team being compromised, either by the Soviets or by sinister elements within the American government. In the end, General Patton was an American titan, a man whose military achievements cemented his place as one of the greatest operational commanders the world has ever seen. His Third Army's legacy of fortitude, audacity, and valor will likely endure throughout the rest of human history. Yet the circumstances of his passing are inextricably linked to his personality. The very aggressiveness that drove him to victory made him both a military genius and, ultimately, a political liability when the fighting stopped. Officially, Patton's death was a tragic statistical accident, the result of a catastrophic spinal injury suffered by an already accident-prone man. However, the strikingly mundane circumstances of his death combined with his outspoken nature means that theories surrounding his death will continue to be discussed alongside his legacy. In the end, the death of General Patton almost feels too small for the size of the man. History is full of towering figures whose final moments never seem to match the legends built around them. Ancient writers understood this discomfort well. They couldn't accept that heroes who shaped empires and toppled kingdoms might simply fall to fever, accident, or age. So they crafted grand exits. Kings were struck down by omens, warriors were claimed by gods, and great leaders met finales worthy of the myths that surrounded them. A mundane death felt like an insult to a monumental life, and we haven't outgrown that impulse. We instinctively resist simple explanations when a giant of history dies quietly. Patton's car crash, paralysis, and hospital decline don't feel like the proper curtain call for one of the greatest field commanders in history. That mismatch invites speculation, and once speculation enters the room, conspiracy theories aren't far behind. That said, while I can't prove it in any way based on the actual evidence we have, Patton's untimely death has always seemed very off to me. Imagine the most admired soldier on the German side of the Second World War, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, celebrated even by his enemies as the chivalrous Desert Fox. But in a quiet room in October 1944, this general would be felled not by the Allies, but by his own government. This was the dramatic culmination of Rommel's ambiguous, yet ultimately fatal, connection to the deadliest internal opposition Hitler ever faced. This was the July 20th plot, codenamed Operation Valkyrie, a plot to eliminate the Führer. After this, The regime needed its greatest hero to vanish quietly, transforming him overnight from a revered military leader into a state-sanctioned martyr. According to the Reich, the war's most popular commander had turned against the leadership and targeted the Austrian artist himself. But to this day, historians question to what extent, if any, the Desert Fox was truly involved in the plot that would ultimately end his life. Erwin Rommel was born in 1891 and embarked on a distinguished military career beginning in World War I, where he earned recognition for his bravery and tactical brilliance. His reputation soared during the early years of the Second World War as the commander of the Afrika Korps in North Africa. Rommel's tactical genius was often juxtaposed with a perceived chivalrous conduct toward his enemies, which helped cultivate a specific historical narrative. By March 1943, having faced overwhelming logistical challenges and superior numbers in North Africa, he was recalled back to Germany. After some shuffling, he would ultimately be assigned to Army Group B, tasked with defending the Normandy coast against the impending Allied invasion. Rommel recognized that the Austrian corporal's strategic incompetence would lead Germany to complete ruin. It was this pragmatic realization of inevitable defeat, compounded by a growing moral unease, that drove him to seek an avenue for a separate peace with the Western Allies. Operation Valkyrie was the code name given to the German military contingency plan designed to be implemented by the Reserve Army in case of massive civil unrest within Germany. The military conspirators, desperate to end the war after strategic disasters like the defeat at Stalingrad, repurposed this bureaucratic plan to serve as the blueprint for their coup d'etat. The leaders of the plot included respected officers, and the central figure who carried out the assassination attempt was Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. The plan had two critical phases. The first was the assassination of the head of state, which Stauffenberg attempted on July 20th, 1944. This was to occur by placing a bomb hidden in a briefcase during a conference at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The second phase, contingent on the success of the first part, involved the immediate activation of the Valkyrie orders across Germany. The Reserve Army was to seize key government installations in Berlin, disarm loyal SS units, and arrest high-ranking officials. Critically, the plan required the senior commanders in the West, where Rommel commanded Army Group B, to consolidate power and neutralize the Reich's apparatus there. The political objectives were straightforward: form a new government, and then negotiate an armistice with the Allies on somewhat favorable terms. The conspirators desperately needed a figure of immense international stature to lend legitimacy to the new regime and signal seriousness to the Western powers during peace negotiations. This necessity made the involvement of a highly respected field marshal like Rommel indispensable. Rommel was undeniably connected to the resistance through his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, who was himself involved in the plot. Evidence indicates that while Rommel agreed completely with the need to remove Germany's leader from power, he drew a fundamental line at assassination. Rommel allegedly viewed the deliberate slaying of the head of state, regardless of how tyrannical that leader was, with distaste, preferring a less violent approach. According to reports from his son and statements from others connected to the plot, Rommel supported a coup that would arrest the leader and place him on trial for his crimes. This wasn't just a moral distaste, though. There was a practical element to it, and he believed that this would simply turn the man into a martyr. Conversely, a public trial would expose his military incompetence and crimes, and would serve to delegitimize the entire ideology. But that brings us to the question of how much Rommel actually knew about the plot. Despite his aversion to the bomb, Rommel's commitment to the broader effort to overthrow the regime was established through testimony under duress. And it must be stated here that the methodology with which these confessions were extracted leaves a lot of questions. Even if no direct threats were made, it was well established by 1944 that if you fell out of line, recriminations would occur, and even your family may be fair game. One conspirator who acted as a liaison to Rommel confessed that Rommel had agreed to actively support the coup. Another resistance leader indicated that the plotters saw Rommel as potentially the future leader of Germany after a transition phase. They saw him as someone who the Western Allies respected and as someone who wasn't completely tainted by the previous regime. The timing of the July 20th plot proved disastrous for Rommel. 3 days before Stauffenberg planted the bomb, on July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighter planes in Normandy, leaving him severely wounded. This injury removed him from the crucial chain of command in the West, just as the coup was launched. The injury, however, provided a convenient cover story later used by the regime. When the bomb failed to land, the resulting purge was swift and brutal. Thousands were arrested and hundreds were executed. Rommel was first implicated when General Stolpnagel, badly injured and captured, repeatedly muttered Rommel's name. He was then subject to brutal quote-unquote interrogation, where he named Rommel as an active supporter of the scheme. The compromised nature of all these confessions, extracted under duress, became the flimsy yet decisive basis for implicating the field marshal. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home with the evidence of his participation. They presented him with an ultimatum: face a public trial before the notorious People's Court and risk harm to his family and friends, or swallow a cyanide capsule. Rommel, in this moment, chose the capsule in exchange for the promise that his wife and son would be left in peace. The regime immediately set about controlling the narrative of Rommel's death. The official paper reported that the beloved field marshal had succumbed to the severe head injuries sustained during the air attack in Normandy. By covering up the event and presenting it as a hero's death, the regime successfully contained the political fallout. There was a full state funeral for Rommel, transforming the secret assassination of the field marshal into a national spectacle for a fallen hero. Exposing Rommel as a traitor would have confirmed to the German populace that opposition was widespread, reaching the highest, most trusted ranks of the Wehrmacht. This would have been a devastating propaganda defeat that the regime couldn't afford in the closing stages of the war. The complexity surrounding Rommel's role ensured the longevity of the historical debate, heavily influenced by the post-war political environment. For decades, the dominant Rommel myth persisted, portraying him as a brilliant, apolitical figure who was merely a tragic victim of the regime. Modern historiography, however, presents a more nuanced picture. While early accounts often presented Rommel's support for the conspiracy as established fact, subsequent research has demonstrated the high degree of ambiguity. At present, the mainstream view acknowledges that Rommel was sympathetic to the goals of the resistance and wanted the painter gone, but didn't agree that assassination was the answer. Many historians now believe that he was organizing his own coup attempt, separate from the July 20th plot, since he fundamentally disagreed with their approach. They've also now accepted that Rommel will almost certainly always remain an ambiguous figure, whose true motivation and involvement will never be known. What's clear is that he was a superb field commander who, late in the war, found his professional loyalty to Germany supersede his political oath to the man at the helm of the state. Hey everyone, before we go on, just hitting you with a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you haven't done so already. Now with that said, let's get back down to business. It was the ultimate air defense response to the ultimate non-threat. In the pre-dawn hours of February 25th, 1942, the City of Angels plunged into a mandatory blackout, only to have the sky violently illuminated by the flashes of anti-aircraft rounds. For nearly an hour, a monumental volume of high-explosive ordnance poured into the night sky, aimed at supposed enemy aircraft. The explosive truth, however, was that these forces had mounted a massive, aggressive, and entirely self-inflicted engagement against an adversary that simply wasn't there. The Great Los Angeles Air Raid, as contemporary sources termed it, can't be understood without appreciating the atmosphere of dread gripping the West Coast in the winter of 1942. Less than 3 months prior, the attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the sense of continental invulnerability. This was replaced with the chilling reality that Imperial Japan could theoretically strike anywhere along the Pacific Rim. As a consequence, many West Coast cities instituted strict nightly blackouts and curfews. This period was also marked by deep suspicion of infiltration, culminating just days earlier with President Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066. This is the now infamous order which authorized the eventual mass incarceration of Japanese Americans on the basis of their ancestry alone. The psychological tension was yanked to a breaking point immediately preceding the Los Angeles incident. On February 23, 1942, the war literally arrived on California's doorstep when the Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced near Santa Barbara and shelled oil facilities at Elwood. This attack marked the first time the continental United States had been directly attacked by a foreign power in over a century. Although the damage to the oil pier and equipment amounted to only about $500, the psychological impact was devastating. Rumors of an imminent massive West Coast invasion spread rapidly, transforming generalized anxiety into acute, immediate expectation of attack. This environment meant that when radar picked up the next ambiguous target, the entire population was primed for mass panic and immediate, overwhelming reaction. The chain of events that led to the barrage began on the evening of February 24th with an initial temporary alert. Radar detected an unidentified target approximately 120 miles west of Los Angeles, prompting sirens to sound at 7:18 p.m. Thousands of air raid sirens went off across Los Angeles County, striking terror into the hearts of everyday citizens. This initial alarm was eventually lifted late that night, somewhat easing the tension. However, the calm was fleeting. After midnight, the situation quickly deteriorated. Radar systems once again tracked an unidentified object approaching the coast. This eventually caused anti-aircraft batteries to be placed on high alert at 2:15 that morning. Just 5 minutes later, an alert went out that mandated a full and complete citywide blackout. Reports began to flood official channels indicating that civilians were seeing enemy planes flying overhead. These reports solidified when a Coast Artillery colonel reported sighting what he estimated to be about 25 planes flying at 12,000 feet over the city. Suddenly, the situation went from a remote threat to deadly serious. This sensory chaos, amplified by the mandatory darkness, became the basis for action. At 2:25 a.m. on February 25th, air raid sirens blared again, mobilizing gunners into position. Between 3:15 and 4:15, the military response commenced. Searchlights, sometimes 9 powerful beams at once, swept the skies, converging on the suspected targets. Anti-aircraft artillery opened fire, unleashing a torrential barrage of tracer rounds and high-explosive shells, causing the air over Los Angeles to erupt. Despite the severity of the ground response, the Army Air Forces demonstrated a degree of prudence, ordering pursuit planes to remain grounded. This decision reflected a rational command calculation to preserve limited fighter forces until the scale and direction of the supposed attack could be confirmed. Further, the Army air commanders questioned the Japanese ability to move an entire fleet with an aircraft carrier so deep into continental American waters. Regardless of their more rational response, the anti-aircraft units continued firing off and on for hours. The indiscriminate firing continued until the coastal artillery finally announced a ceasefire around dawn. The all clear was not sounded until 7:21 a.m. When the blackout order was finally lifted, citizens discovered that the true damage wasn't caused by Japanese bombs, but by American shrapnel. Over 1,000 heavy shells designed to explode at altitude failed to detonate and rained down across a 40-mile arc, stretching from Santa Monica to Long Beach. Shrapnel damaged buildings and vehicles, with reports describing fragments piercing homes and even landing in civilians' beds. Perhaps unsurprisingly, no enemy planes were ever found, and no wreckage was ever recovered to indicate a Japanese presence. The human toll was tragic and entirely indirect. 5 civilians died as a result of the incident. 3 of these fatalities occurred due to traffic accidents spurred by the chaos of the citywide blackout and panicked movement. Additionally, 2 others died from heart attacks, which contemporary accounts attributed to the overwhelming stress of the bombardment. A number of the anti-aircraft station operators were also injured, while frantically reporting to their posts that night. The lack of any tangible enemy threat following such an immense military effort immediately led to profound public confusion and institutional conflict. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, held a press conference shortly after the incident, publicly declaring the purported attack to be nothing more than a false alarm. He attributed the whole event to anxiety and jittery nerves in the wake of recent events. However, this attempt to quell the panic was instantly undermined by the Army. Secretary of War Henry Stimson contradicted Knox, insisting that between 1 and 15 unidentified aircraft had been sighted over the area. Stimson hypothesized that these targets might have been commercial aircraft flown by enemy agents operating out of secret airfields in Mexico. According to him, these operatives may have been Japanese, or they may have been German, or they may even have been local Mexican sympathizers or American Fifth columnists. This immediate and severe disagreement between the highest levels of the military and government fueled public suspicion. Local newspapers deepened the confusion. The Los Angeles Times, for instance, prominently declared that the area had been raided by foreign aircraft. This lack of authoritative unity meant that a physical error, firing at nothing, was quickly transformed into a political controversy. This in turn would provide the essential starting point for decades of speculation about a cover-up. Although the controversy raged in the immediate aftermath, military historians and analysts have since constructed a clear and rational explanation for the quote-unquote battle. In essence, to drop a meme, California hurt itself in its confusion, but it's a bit more complicated than that. The official theory centers on the idea of mass hysteria and misidentification, a phenomenon fueled by the preceding day's events. A significant review conducted in 1949 by the United States Coast Artillery Association identified a specific meteorological balloon, launched at 1 o'clock that morning. According to them, this was the single object likely responsible for triggering the entire incident. The review concluded that once the initial firing commenced, the spectacle of searchlights and exploding shells caused the collective imagination to create additional targets in the sky. They also speculated that some of the defenders simply went along with the crowd, even though they didn't see anything at all. In my mind, it's basically the 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong effect. If so many other people are doing it, you ought to be doing it too. The fact that multiple batteries opened fire, seeing the light show caused by their neighbors, led to an exponential increase in reported so-called enemy contacts. This theory gained greater official weight in 1983 when the U.S. Office of Air Force History revisited the event. They concluded that the Battle of Los Angeles was a textbook case of war nerves triggered by a lost weather balloon. Further supporting this consensus is the technical critique that the targets, whatever they were moving too slowly to be the high-speed Japanese warplanes. Moreover, post-war intelligence provided the final confirmation. Japanese authorities affirmed that they had not sent any aircraft over Los Angeles during the time of the air raid. While it might be natural to doubt this, given the extreme horrors that the post-war Japanese government admitted to the Americans, this event doesn't even rank. In the history of World War II, the Battle of Los Angeles is often cited as a prime example of massive defensive overreaction and institutional confusion. Yet, the lack of definitive, unified governmental closure in 1942 allowed the incident to transcend its factual basis and grow into one of our great modern mysteries. The void left by the contradictory statements of Secretaries Knox and Stimson became fertile ground for speculation. Decades later, specifically with the rise of interest in extraterrestrial visitation, the narrative shifted dramatically. Proponents seized upon the event, asserting that the massive anti-aircraft barrage proved that the military had engaged with spacecraft. This powerful narrative often relies heavily on a single piece of visual evidence, a photograph published by the Los Angeles Times on February 26, 1942. The image appears to show searchlights converging on a central massive object in the sky. However, it's been noted that this photo was heavily retouched by the newspaper's photo editors to improve contrast and visibility for black and white newsprint. Critics argue that this routine artistic enhancement created the illusion of a distinct solid object encircled by the lights.